The stone cracked against the crow's wing before the bird even had time to lift off the fence post, and Wren's sable was already reaching for a second one when she realized the bird had not touched a single ribbon. It simply sat there, watching her with black, glassy eyes, as if it found her rage amusing. She lowered her arm slowly, breathing hard, and looked at the drying line strung between two posts behind her workshop. 6 ribbons had hung there the night before. Now only 4 remained, and the 2 that were missing had been her best work, dyed deep red with crushed madder root, the kind of color that took her 3 days to get right. This was the 4th morning in a row that ribbons had vanished from her line, and each time she had blamed the crows that nested in the eaves of her workshop roof. It made sense to her. Crows were known to steal shiny things, bright things, anything that caught the light. Her ribbons caught the light beautifully. She had told herself this story so many times that she almost believed it completely, even though a small, nagging part of her mind kept whispering that crows did not usually take cloth. They took coins, buttons, small bits of metal. Not ribbon, not fabric that could not be eaten or used to build anything a bird would want. She pushed the thought away and gathered the remaining ribbons into her basket, her fingers trembling slightly from the cold morning air and from frustration. The village of Ashran sat at the edge of the Draven Pack's territory, tucked between 2 ridgelines thick with pine and fog, far enough from the king's court that most villagers went their whole lives without seeing him even once. Wren had heard stories, of course. Everyone had. Alpha King Kaelin Draven, ruler of the largest and strongest pack in the region, known for a temper so controlled that some said he had none at all, and for a wolf so private that even his own guards rarely saw it. But those stories belonged to another world, one made of stone towers and iron gates. Wren's world was smaller. It was thread and dye, and the smell of wet wool drying by the fire. She worked as a weaver, one of the few Omegas in Ashran who lived alone, and ran her own trade without a mate or a den to answer to. Some villagers found this strange. Others found it admirable. Wren herself rarely thought about it at all. She simply woke each morning, fed her small fire, mixed her dyes, and worked until her fingers ached. Ribbons were her specialty. She sold them at the market for hairpieces, for binding letters, for weddings and festivals, and lately, for reasons she could not explain, someone or something kept stealing them, faster than she could replace them. She spent the rest of the morning inside her workshop, trying to focus on a new batch of blue dye, but her mind kept drifting back to the empty spaces on her line. By midday, she had made a decision. If the crows would not stop taking her work, she would catch one in the act and prove it to herself, if nothing else. She walked to the small shop near the village well and bought a pouch of ground pepper from old Betten, the herb seller, who asked no questions when Wren explained she needed it to stop thieves. Betten simply nodded and said that pepper had stopped worse than crows in her day. That evening, Wren prepared her trap with the same care she gave to her weaving. She chose her finest ribbon, one dyed in a rich shade of woad blue that had taken her nearly a week to perfect, and she dusted the underside of it lightly with pepper, being careful not to ruin the color. She pinned it loosely to the line, loose enough to pull free with a single tug, tight enough that whatever took it would have to work for it. Then she carried a stool to the edge of her garden, behind a thick patch of ferns, and settled in to wait. The sun dropped behind the ridgeline slowly, painting the sky in shades of orange and violet that Wren might have admired on any other evening. Tonight, she barely noticed. Her eyes stayed fixed on the ribbon, watching it sway gently in the breeze, waiting for a shadow to fall across it. The village grew quiet around her. Smoke rose from chimneys. A dog barked somewhere down the lane, then stopped. An owl called once, then silence again. Hours passed, or what felt like hours, and Wren's legs began to cramp from sitting so still. She was on the edge of giving up, telling herself that whatever thief had been visiting her line had finally moved on to easier prey, when she heard it. A soft crunch of dry leaves, deliberate and heavy, far too heavy for any bird. She froze, her hand tightening around the stone she had brought just in case. The sound came again, closer this time, moving along the tree line at the edge of her garden. What stepped out of the shadows was not a crow. It was a wolf, but unlike any wolf Wren had ever seen near the village. It stood taller than a horse at the shoulder, its coat a deep silver that darkened to black along its spine and legs, with a scar cutting across one side of its muzzle that caught the moonlight in a pale, thin line. Its eyes were the color of amber, and they held an intelligence that made the breath catch in Wren's throat. She had seen wolves before, plenty of them, since wolf shifters made up most of the packs in this territory. But something about the size and bearing of this one told her instantly that this was no ordinary pack member out hunting rabbits. The wolf moved toward the drying line without hesitation, its steps quiet despite its size, its nose lifted slightly, as if it already knew exactly which ribbon it wanted. Wren's heart pounded so hard she was certain the animal could hear it. She should have run. Every instinct told her that a wolf this size, this close to her home, in the dark, was not something a lone Omega should watch from behind a fern with nothing but a stone in her hand. But she did not run. She stayed frozen, half from fear, and half from something closer to fascination, as the wolf reached the line and closed its jaws gently around the pepper-dusted ribbon. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the wolf's whole body went rigid, its nose wrinkled violently, and Wren watched, stunned, as the massive creature sneezed so hard that its front paws lifted clean off the ground. The sound echoed through the quiet garden, sharp and undignified, nothing like the low growls she might have expected. The wolf sneezed again, stumbling sideways, and its shoulder caught the edge of her drying rack, sending it toppling over with a clatter of wood against stone. Wren clapped a hand over her own mouth to keep from making a sound, though whether to stifle a scream or a laugh, she genuinely could not say. The wolf shook its great head from side to side, ribbons still dangling absurdly from one side of its jaw, sneezing a third time, with such force that it actually took a step backward to keep its balance. In the moonlight, with pepper dust scattering from its fur and the fallen rack lying broken beside it, the mighty animal looked less like a predator and more like an oversized dog caught in the act of raiding a kitchen. Something in Wren's chest loosened. The fear that had gripped her only moments before began to ease, replaced by a strange, cautious curiosity. She lowered the stone in her hand, though she did not let it go entirely, and rose slowly from behind the ferns. The wolf's head snapped toward her instantly, ears flattening, body going still in a way that made her freeze again too. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other across the wrecked garden, the ribbon still hanging from the wolf's jaw like a strange, colorful trophy. "You are not a crow," Wren said finally, her voice quieter and steadier than she expected it to be. She almost laughed at how ridiculous the words sounded once they left her mouth, but there was no other way to describe the absurdity of the moment. A wolf the size of a small horse had just sneezed itself into her broken drying rack while trying to steal a ribbon she had blamed on birds for 4 days straight. The wolf did not attack, it did not growl or bare its teeth, or do any of the things Wren had been taught to expect from a strange predator caught trespassing. Instead, it lowered its great head slightly, ears still flat, and made a low sound in its throat that was almost, though not quite, a whine. There was something in its posture that Wren recognized immediately, something she had seen 100 times in guilty children and sheepish dogs back when her family kept them on the farm. The wolf looked ashamed. She took a careful step forward, testing the space between them, and the wolf did not retreat, though every muscle in its huge body seemed coiled with tension, ready to bolt at the first wrong move. Wren's hands were shaking now, adrenaline finally catching up with her, but she kept her voice low and even, the same tone she used when calming a frightened animal that had wandered too close to her fire. "I do not know what you are," she said, "or why you wanted my ribbons badly enough to come all the way down here for them, but you have made a mess of my garden and scared 4 years off my life, so the least you can do is give that one back." She was not entirely sure why she said it. Perhaps it was nerves talking, filling the silence because silence felt too dangerous. But something in the wolf's expression, if a wolf's face could truly be called expressive, shifted at her words. It lowered its head further, and, with startling gentleness for a creature so large, set the ribbon down at her feet. Then it stepped back, watching her with those unsettling amber eyes, waiting. Wren bent down slowly, never taking her eyes off the wolf, and picked up the pepper-dusted ribbon. It was slightly damp from the animal's mouth, but otherwise unharmed. She held it up between them, almost as if presenting evidence in a trial only she understood the rules of. "This is the last one you take," she told the wolf firmly, though her voice wavered slightly at the end. "I work hard for these. Whatever it is you want them for, you cannot just come and take them whenever you please." The wolf tilted its head, an oddly human gesture, and made that same low sound again, softer this time. Then, Without warning, it turned and moved back toward the tree line, pausing once to glance over its shoulder at her, before disappearing entirely into the dark woods beyond her garden. Wren stood there for a long moment afterward, ribbon clutched in her hand, heart still racing, staring at the empty space where the enormous creature had vanished. She should have been terrified. Every sensible instinct told her she should go inside immediately, bar her door, and never sit out with a trap again. Instead, she found herself glancing toward the broken drying rack, toward the pepper dust still scattered across the grass, and feeling something entirely unexpected settle over her. Not fear, curiosity, a strange, persistent question that refused to leave her mind, no matter how she tried to push it away. Why would a wolf that size want ribbons at all? She thought of the missing ribbons from the past 4 days, the deep reds and soft golds she had spent hours dyeing and drying, each one carefully chosen from her best work. It struck her then that the wolf had not simply grabbed whatever was closest each time. It had taken specific pieces, always her finer work, always the colors that had taken longest to perfect. That was not the behavior of a scavenger looking for something shiny to chew on. That was the behavior of something choosing. Wren gathered up the fallen drying rack, setting the pieces aside to repair in the morning, and carried her basket of remaining ribbons back inside her workshop. She barred the door out of habit rather than real fear, and sat by her dying fire for a long while, turning the pepper-dusted ribbon over in her hands, thinking about amber eyes, and a scarred muzzle, and a sneeze loud enough to wake the dead. Sleep did not come easily that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the wolf again, standing at the edge of her garden, ribbon hanging from its jaw, looking at her not with hunger, but with something closer to longing. It was a foolish thought, she told herself. Wolves did not long for anything but food, and territory, and pack. And yet the image would not leave her, no matter how many times she turned onto her side, and tried to force her mind toward sleep instead. By the time the first gray light of dawn crept through the gaps in her shutters, Wren had made a decision she was not entirely sure was wise. She was going to find out where that wolf went. She was going to find out what it wanted, with her ribbons badly enough to sneak into her garden 4 nights in a row, and risk a face full of pepper to get them. Whatever answer waited for her at the end of that decision, she suspected it would be far stranger than crows. She rose before the sun had fully cleared the ridgeline, dressed quickly, and packed a small satchel with bread, a water skin, and a walking stick she rarely needed but felt better carrying. Outside, the grass was still damp with dew, and the broken drying rack lay exactly where she had left it, a small, splintered reminder that the night before had not been some strange dream brought on by too little sleep and too much frustration. She crouched near the tree line where the wolf had vanished and studied the ground carefully. It did not take long to find what she was looking for. Large paw prints pressed deep into the soft earth, spaced wide apart in a pattern that suggested a confident, purposeful stride, rather than the frantic scattering of a frightened animal. The prints led away from her garden and up toward the ridge that rose behind the village, disappearing into thicker brush where the morning light barely reached. Wren straightened, tightened the strap of her satchel across her shoulder, and began to follow them. She told herself, as she walked, that this was simply about protecting her livelihood. If some strange, oversized wolf had decided her ribbons made good building material for whatever den it called home, she deserved to know why, and perhaps to negotiate some kind of arrangement that did not involve her waking up to fewer supplies every single morning. That was the story she repeated to herself with every step up the increasingly steep and rocky path. It was practical. It was reasonable. It had absolutely nothing to do with the strange pull she had felt standing across from those amber eyes the night before, or the ridiculous image of a massive wolf sneezing itself sideways into a garden rack that she could not quite stop smiling about even now. The trail led higher than she expected, winding through dense pine and over patches of exposed gray stone, until the sounds of the village faded completely behind her, replaced by wind moving through branches and the distant call of a hawk somewhere above. Wren paused several times to catch her breath and to reassure herself that turning back was still an option, though each time she found her feet already moving forward again before she had fully decided. It was nearly mid-morning when she came upon the first ribbon. It hung from a low branch beside the trail, a faded strip of yellow that she recognized instantly as one of the earliest pieces taken from her line, weeks ago, long before she had started blaming the crows in earnest. It was weathered now, sun-bleached at the edges, but unmistakably hers. A few steps further, she found another, this one looped loosely around a jutting root, half buried under fallen pine needles, as if it had slipped free and never been retrieved. Her pulse quickened. She was close to something. She could feel it, though she still had no idea what that something might turn out to be. The path narrowed further, cutting between two large boulders, before opening into a small clearing, near the base of a rocky outcrop. And there, tucked into a hollow carved naturally into the stone, she saw it. A den. It was larger than she expected, its entrance wide enough for the massive wolf she had seen the night before to pass through easily, and lined, impossibly, with ribbons. Dozens of them, woven carefully between moss and soft pine needles, forming a nest unlike anything Wren had ever seen. Reds and golds and deep blues, all her missing work, arranged not haphazardly, but with what could only be described as care, layered in a way that suggested thought rather than random collection. Wren stood frozen at the edge of the clearing, staring at the den, her mind struggling to reconcile what she was seeing with everything she had assumed about crows and thieves and simple explanations. This was not the work of a scavenger. No animal driven purely by instinct would arrange stolen cloth with this much apparent intention, would choose colors that complemented one another, would build something that looked, more than anything else, like a home. She took a step closer, drawn forward despite every warning bell ringing in the back of her mind, and that was when she heard the low growl behind her. Wren spun around, heart lodging itself somewhere in her throat, and found herself face to face once more with the enormous silver-black wolf, standing just a few paces away at the edge of the trail she had followed up the mountain. Its amber eyes were fixed on her, its body tense, and for the first time since their encounter the night before, Wren felt a genuine flicker of real fear. But the growl did not deepen. The wolf did not lunge or bare its teeth further. Instead, it seemed to catch itself, ears flattening in what Wren was beginning to recognize as embarrassment rather than aggression, and it took a slow step backward, putting distance between them rather than closing it. Its gaze moved past her, toward the den behind her, then back to her face, and something in its posture shifted from defensive to almost pleading. "You built this," Wren said quietly, more to herself than to the wolf, though the animal's ears twitched at the sound of her voice regardless. "All of this. With my ribbons." The wolf made no move to answer, of course, because wolves did not speak, and yet Wren found herself waiting anyway, as if some part of her expected a response. The silence stretched between them, filled only by the wind moving through the pines and the distant call of the hawk circling somewhere far overhead. Wren looked back at the den, at the careful weave of color against stone and moss, and felt the last of her anger from the past 4 mornings dissolve into something far more complicated. Not quite understanding, not yet, but something close to it, something that told her this strange creature standing before her, whatever it truly was, had not stolen from her out of simple greed. It had been building something, and somehow, without either of them fully understanding why, her ribbons had become a part of it. The wolf shifted its weight, glancing once more toward the den and then back at her, and Wren realized with a small jolt that it was waiting to see what she would do next, whether she would run, whether she would scream for help that was too far away to hear her, whether she would finally understand what 4 mornings of missing ribbons had truly meant. She lowered her satchel slowly to the ground, keeping her movements unhurried and deliberate, the same way she might approach a spooked animal she hoped to calm, rather than frighten further away. "I am not going to hurt you," she said softly, though the words felt strange leaving her mouth when directed at a creature easily 3 times her size. "But you are going to have to explain yourself somehow, because I have questions, and I suspect the answers are stranger than either of us is ready for." The wolf watched her for a long moment, amber eyes steady and searching, and then, slowly, it lowered itself onto its haunches, no longer poised to flee or defend, simply waiting. Wren took that as an invitation, however uncertain, and settled herself carefully onto a nearby rock, close enough to see the den clearly, but far enough to give the massive animal room to breathe. Whatever this was, whatever strange turn her ordinary life had just taken on a quiet mountain trail above a quiet village, Wren understood one thing with sudden, absolute clarity. Nothing about the next chapter of her life was going to be simple again. The wolf did not move from its place on the rocky ground, and neither did Ren, though the silence between them stretched long enough that she began to wonder if she had imagined the entire strange understanding that seemed to pass between them only moments before. She studied the animal carefully now that her fear had settled into something more manageable, noting details she had missed the night before in the dark. The scar across its muzzle was old, healed long ago, pale against the silver fur. Its paws were larger than seemed natural, even for a wolf of its size, and there was a stillness to it, a controlled quality in the way it held itself, that reminded her more of a soldier standing at attention than any wild animal she had ever encountered. "You are not just a wolf, are you?" she said finally, breaking the silence. "Somewhere in these hills there is a person wearing your skin, and I think you know exactly what I am talking about even if you cannot say so." The wolf's ears flicked at her words, and for a moment, she thought she saw something like resignation pass through its amber eyes. Then, without warning, the air around the animal seemed to shimmer, the edges of its silhouette blurring and reshaping in a way that made Ren's breath catch in her throat despite every story she had ever heard about shifters and their two forms. She had seen shifting happen before, from a careful distance during festival demonstrations, but never this close, and never so suddenly. Where the wolf had crouched, a man now knelt instead, broad-shouldered and bare from the waist up, his dark hair falling loose around a face that Ren recognized, with a jolt of pure disbelief, from coins and festival banners and the rare formal portrait displayed in the village hall. It was not possible. It could not be possible, and yet there was no mistaking the sharp line of his jaw, the same amber eyes now set into a human face, the same scar cutting faintly across one cheek that she had seen moments before on a wolf's muzzle. "You are the king," Ren said, her voice barely above a whisper. The words felt absurd, even as she spoke them, standing on a quiet mountainside with nothing but pine trees and stolen ribbons as witnesses. Kalen Draven did not deny it. He remained kneeling where he had shifted, clearly uncertain of what to do with his hands, or his eyes, or the sudden and complete loss of the animal instincts that had made his previous encounters with her so much simpler to navigate. Being caught was one thing. Being caught and then required to explain himself with words instead of a well-timed sneeze was an entirely different challenge, and one he found he was far less prepared for than any negotiation he had ever conducted at court. "I did not mean for you to find out this way," he said finally, his voice low and rough, as though speaking after a long silence. "I did not mean for you to find out at all, if I am being honest with myself." Ren stared at him, torn between the urge to laugh at the absurdity of the situation and the urge to demand a full explanation immediately. "You have been stealing from me," she said instead, settling somewhere in the middle. "For weeks, the Alpha King of this entire territory has been sneaking through Ashran at night to steal ribbons from a village weaver, and blaming crows for it apparently was not even your idea, since I came up with that excuse entirely on my own." Something that might have been the beginning of a smile flickered across his face before he caught it, and smoothed his expression back into something more careful, more controlled. "I never claimed it was crows," he said. "That misunderstanding was entirely your own creation. I simply did not correct it, because correcting it would have required an explanation I did not have." "And do you have one now?" Ren asked, crossing her arms and nodding toward the den behind her, still lined with dozens of her carefully dyed ribbons woven between moss and stone. "Because that looks like a great deal of effort for a man who claims not to understand his own actions." Kalen's gaze moved past her to the den, and something shifted in his expression, a vulnerability that seemed entirely out of place on a face she had only ever seen depicted with stern authority on coins and banners. He rose slowly to his feet, taller than she expected now that he stood as a man rather than crouched as a wolf, and moved a few steps closer to the entrance of the den, though he did not enter it. "My wolf has not settled anywhere in a very long time," he said quietly. "Not since before you were likely old enough to remember much of anything. There was a bond once, years ago, and when it ended, something in him refused to rest again. He has wandered these hills for longer than I care to admit, restless, unable to find comfort in any den I have offered him, in any territory I have claimed. And then, several weeks ago, during a routine patrol near your village, he caught the scent of something on the evening wind that made him stop entirely." Ren felt her chest tighten unexpectedly at the raw honesty in his voice, though she was careful not to let it show too plainly on her face. "What scent?" she asked, though some part of her already suspected the answer before he gave it. Yours, he said simply. The madder root and woad you use in your dyes. It should have meant nothing to him. It is only cloth and color, nothing a wolf should care for at all. And yet he followed it back to your workshop, and once he had, he could not seem to stay away. The confession hung in the air between them, more vulnerable than Ren had expected from a man whose reputation, as far as she had ever heard it discussed in the village market, painted him as cold and unreadable, a king who governed through calculated distance rather than open feeling. This version of him, standing awkwardly at the edge of a den lined with stolen ribbons, admitting that some restless part of himself had been drawn to her without his full understanding or permission, bore almost no resemblance to that reputation at all. I do not know what to do with that information, Ren admitted honestly, because it is a strange thing to be told, and I am not certain it explains the theft so much as it explains the reason behind it, which is a different matter entirely. Kalen's expression sobered further, and he inclined his head slightly, an acknowledgement rather than an apology, though she suspected an actual apology was coming close behind it. You are right to be frustrated, he said. What I did was wrong, regardless of the reason behind it, and I will replace everything that was taken, along with fair payment for your trouble, and for the drying rack, which I understand did not survive the encounter particularly well. Despite herself, Ren felt the corner of her mouth twitch upward at the memory of the enormous wolf sneezing itself sideways into her garden the night before, pepper dust scattering everywhere, while the rack splintered beneath his weight. That rack has seen better days regardless of your involvement, she said. Though I will admit the manner of its destruction was memorable. A real smile broke across his face then, brief but genuine, transforming his features into something far less guarded than the careful mask he had been wearing since shifting back. That pepper was clever, he said. I did not expect it. My wolf certainly did not expect it either, and I suspect he will think twice before approaching your line again without proper warning. Good, Ren said firmly, though there was less heat in the word than there had been the night before. Because I work hard for those ribbons, and while I understand now that you were not simply taking them out of cruelty, that does not mean you have permission to keep taking them either. Kalen nodded, accepting the terms without argument, and something in his posture eased slightly, as though a weight he had been carrying for weeks had finally been set down, even if only partially. I understand, he said, though I will admit, seeing them woven into the den does something to settle him that nothing else has managed in years. If there were some arrangement that did not involve theft, some way to continue that without dishonesty between us, I would welcome it. Ren considered him for a long moment, weighing the strangeness of the entire situation against the quiet sincerity in his voice. She thought of the years of restlessness he had described, the bond broken before her time, the wandering that had brought his wolf, against all reason, to her small workshop and her carefully dyed ribbons. It was a great deal to accept in the space of a single morning, and yet standing there on the quiet mountainside, with the den behind her woven through with her own work, in colors she had chosen and mixed with her own hands, she found herself less inclined toward anger than she might have expected. Perhaps, she said slowly, there is room for some kind of arrangement, though I will decide which ribbons you may have, and you will ask rather than simply taking them in the night while I am asleep and unable to properly appreciate the theft as it happens. Kalen's smile widened slightly at that, and he inclined his head again, this time with something closer to genuine warmth than formal acknowledgement. That seems more than fair, he said, though I should warn you that my wolf may still find your workshop difficult to stay away from entirely, even with proper permission secured. Ren found herself smiling back, despite every instinct telling her that this entire situation was far stranger than anything she had expected when she woke that morning, determined only to track down a thieving crow. Then he will simply have to learn patience, she said, and something about the exchange, light and easy despite the strangeness surrounding it, made the mountainside feel suddenly less remote, and far more like the beginning of something neither of them had quite anticipated. They stood there a while longer, the king and the weaver, discussing terms neither of them had ever imagined negotiating, while somewhere below them, the village of Ashran carried on entirely unaware that the crows they blamed for so much mischief had, in fact, done nothing wrong at all. 3 weeks passed, and the village of Ashran settled into a rhythm that Ren still found difficult to believe whenever she stopped to think about it directly. Twice each week, always after sunset, The wolf came down from the ridge and waited at the edge of her garden, patient now, never touching the drying line without first catching her eye through the workshop window. She would step outside, select a ribbon or two from pieces she no longer needed for market, and hand them over properly, and the wolf would take them gently, before disappearing back into the trees. It was, by any measure, a strange arrangement, and yet it had become oddly comfortable, in a way Wren struggled to explain even to herself. She had not seen Calen in his human form since that first morning on the mountainside, and some part of her wondered if he was keeping his distance deliberately, giving her space to grow accustomed to the wolf before attempting anything closer to friendship as a man. If that was his intention, it seemed to be working, because she found herself looking forward to those evening visits more than she was willing to admit, even to Mira Loft, her closest friend in the village, and the only person who had noticed the change in her mood over the past several weeks. "You have been humming while you work," Mira said one afternoon, leaning against the workshop doorframe with a basket of eggs balanced on one hip. "You never hum. Something has changed, and I intend to find out what it is before the day is over." Wren kept her eyes fixed on the dye pot in front of her, stirring more carefully than the task strictly required. "Nothing has changed," she said, though the denial came out weaker than she intended. "I have simply been sleeping better." Mira raised an eyebrow, clearly unconvinced, but she did not press further, and Wren was grateful for the small mercy, even as guilt gnawed at her, for keeping such an enormous secret from someone she trusted completely. It was not that she doubted Mira's discretion. It was that the truth felt too large, too strange, too likely to unravel everything the moment it left her mouth. The alpha king of the entire territory had been sneaking down from his court to sit at the edge of her garden as a wolf 3 nights out of every week, and Wren still was not entirely certain how she felt about any of it, let alone how she might explain it to someone else. Far from Ashran, within the stone walls of Draven Keep, a very different kind of curiosity had begun to take root. Edmund Hale, the king's most trusted advisor, and a man who had served the Draven line since before Caelan's father passed the crown to his son, had noticed his king's absences with growing concern. 3 evenings each week, without fail, Calen disappeared shortly after sunset and did not return until well past midnight, offering no explanation beyond a curt statement that he required time alone as his wolf. It was not unusual for an alpha to need solitary time in wolf form. Every shifter understood the pull of instinct that sometimes required release beyond the constraints of court and duty. What troubled Edmund was the change he saw in Calen upon his return each time. The king who came back through the gates after those evening absences carried himself differently than the king who had ruled Draven Pack for the past several years, tense and controlled, and rarely at ease even among his closest advisors. This version of Calen walked with something looser in his shoulders, something almost peaceful in his expression, and Edmund had known the man long enough to recognize that peace as something entirely new. He raised the matter carefully one evening, after the evening council had concluded, and only the 2 of them remained in the war room. Maps of the territory still spread across the long table between them. "You seem lighter these days," Edmund observed, choosing his words with the caution of a man who had learned long ago that Calen Draven did not respond well to being questioned directly about his personal matters. "I find myself curious what has changed." Calen did not look up from the map in front of him, though Edmund noticed the faint tightening at the corner of his mouth that suggested the question had landed closer to a truth Calen was not yet ready to share. "Nothing has changed that concerns pack business," he said evenly. "My time is my own to spend as I see fit, Edmund, and I would prefer not to have it questioned simply because you have grown suspicious of my improved mood." It was as close to a confirmation as Edmund was likely to receive, and he chose not to push further, though he made a private note to keep watching, not out of distrust exactly, but out of the deep loyalty that came from decades of service to a family he had sworn to protect in every sense of the word. Whatever had changed in his king, Edmund intended to understand it before it became something that might threaten the stability of the pack, though he sincerely hoped, for Calen's sake, that it would prove to be nothing more than a simple and well-deserved happiness. Back in Ashran, that same evening brought a storm that rolled in faster and harder than anyone in the village had anticipated. Wren had been finishing a late batch of dye when the first crack of thunder split the sky, followed almost immediately by rain so heavy it sounded like handfuls of gravel thrown against her workshop roof. She hurried to secure her shutters, cursing under her breath as wind tore at the door and threatened to rip it from her grip entirely. It was in the middle of securing the last shutter that she remembered the ribbons still hanging on the outside line, forgotten in her rush to finish the day's dyeing before the weather turned. She hesitated only a moment before pulling her cloak tight and stepping out into the storm, moving quickly toward the line where wind whipped the fabric strips into a frantic dance against the darkening sky. She had barely gathered half of them when a particularly violent gust knocked her sideways, and her foot caught against a root, exposed by weeks of dry weather, now turned suddenly to mud. She went down hard, pain flaring through her ankle as she twisted awkwardly to avoid crushing the ribbons still clutched in her hand. And for a moment, the storm seemed to close in around her entirely, rain stinging her eyes, thunder rattling through the ground beneath her. She heard the wolf before she saw him, a low, urgent sound cutting through the noise of the storm, and then he was there, massive and silver-black against the darkness, positioning himself between her and the worst of the wind while she struggled to right herself. His body blocked the gale enough that she could finally catch her breath, and she reached out instinctively, gripping a handful of his soaked fur for balance as she pulled herself upright, wincing at the sharp protest from her ankle. "I am fine," she gasped, though the tremor in her voice suggested otherwise. "Just twisted it. I need to get inside before this gets any worse." The wolf did not wait for further explanation. He shifted his weight beneath her, allowing her to lean her full weight against his side, and together they made their slow, awkward way back toward the workshop, rain lashing at them the entire distance. By the time they reached her door, both were soaked through, and Wren's ankle throbbed with every step, but she was inside, out of the worst of the storm, with the wolf pressed close beside her as she collapsed onto the small bench near her fire. She looked at him properly then, water dripping from his fur onto her floor, chest heaving slightly from the effort of the short but difficult journey, and something in her chest tightened at the realization that he had come down through that storm without hesitation the moment she needed him. "You did not have to do that," she said quietly, reaching for a cloth to press against the worst of her rain-soaked hair. "But thank you." The wolf settled onto the floor beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his massive body, despite the rain still clinging to his fur, and made no move to leave despite the storm continuing to rage outside. Wren found herself smiling despite the pain still throbbing in her ankle, and she reached out slowly to rest her hand against the top of his head, half expecting him to pull away. He did not pull away. He leaned into the touch instead, closing his eyes briefly, in a gesture so unguarded, so unlike anything she imagined an Alpha King's wolf capable of showing, that something warm and unfamiliar bloomed in her chest, spreading slowly through her until it settled somewhere she was not entirely ready to name. They sat together like that for a long while, the storm gradually softening outside, the fire crackling low and steady beside them, and Wren realized somewhere in that quiet stretch of time that whatever this strange arrangement between them had started as, it had become something else entirely. Something she was no longer certain she wanted to give up, even once the storm passed and the world outside returned to its ordinary shape once more. When the wolf finally rose to leave, well past midnight, the rain reduced to a gentle patter against her roof. He paused at the door and looked back at her, amber eyes catching the low firelight in a way that made her breath catch unexpectedly. "Be careful going back," she said softly. "The paths will be slick after all that rain." He made a low sound in response, something that might have been reassurance, and then he was gone, disappearing into the wet darkness beyond her door, leaving Wren alone with her aching ankle and a heart that felt considerably more complicated than it had only a few hours before. She did not know, as she settled into bed that night, that far across the territory, near the western border where Draven land met the edge of a rival pack's claimed hunting grounds, scouts loyal to an alpha named Thorn Ashcombe had spent that same storm testing the strength of Draven patrols, noting gaps in coverage, recording which paths went unguarded during the worst of the weather. Thorn had been watching the Draven pack for months, waiting patiently for any sign of weakness he might exploit, and though he did not yet know the specific cause, rumors had begun reaching him that the Alpha King's attention had grown divided in recent weeks. His focus pulled towards something, or someone, far from the concerns of border and territory. It was exactly the kind of weakness Thorn had been waiting for, and as the storm cleared over Ashrin, and Wren slept soundly for the first time in days, plans were already forming in a den far to the west, that would soon draw her small, quiet life into a conflict she had never imagined herself becoming part of. Word of a stranger asking questions in Ashran reached Ren 3 days after the storm, carried by Betten the herb seller, who mentioned it almost in passing, while wrapping a fresh bundle of dried lavender for one of Ren's dye experiments. A man had come through the market the day before, Betten said, well-dressed but not from anywhere nearby, asking odd questions about the village weaver and whether she had any connections to Draven Keep. Ren had laughed it off at the time, assuring Betten that she had no connections to anyone important and that the stranger had likely confused her with someone else entirely. But the unease did not leave her, not fully, and that evening, when the wolf arrived at her garden as usual, she found herself watching the tree line more carefully than before, half expecting to see another shadow lurking somewhere among the pines. The wolf noticed her tension immediately, ears pricking forward, nose lifting slightly, as though testing the air for whatever had unsettled her. Someone was asking about me in the market, she told him, keeping her voice low even though there was no one nearby to overhear. A stranger. Betten said he mentioned Draven Keep. The wolf's entire posture changed at her words, tension replacing the easy calm he usually carried during these evening visits. He moved closer, pressing his side against her legs in a way that felt protective rather than simply affectionate, and made a low sound deep in his chest that Ren was beginning to understand as something close to a warning, though she could not have said exactly what it warned against. That night, for the first time since their arrangement began, the wolf did not leave when the moon reached its highest point. He stayed until nearly dawn, alert and watchful, pacing occasionally near the edge of her garden, before returning to settle close beside her workshop door. Ren did not sleep much either, though she found comfort in his presence despite the strange unease that had settled over the evening, and when he finally rose to leave as the sky began to lighten, he paused longer than usual at her door, amber eyes searching her face as though trying to memorize it. 2 days later, Kalen came to her, in his human form for the first time since the mountainside, arriving not at dusk, but in the middle of the afternoon, dressed simply enough that he might have passed for any traveling merchant, if not for the quiet authority that clung to him, regardless of his clothing. Ren nearly dropped the spindle she had been working with when she looked up and found him standing in her doorway, sunlight cutting sharp lines across features she had only seen clearly once before. "I need to speak with you properly," he said, and something in his tone told her immediately that whatever brought him here in daylight was serious enough to abandon whatever caution had kept him in wolf form during their previous visits. She set the spindle aside and gestured him inside, closing the door behind them, though she was not entirely sure why the instinct to hide his presence struck her so strongly. "A man has been asking questions about you in the market," he said without preamble, confirming what Betten had already told her, though the confirmation did little to settle the growing knot of worry in her stomach. "My scouts identified him yesterday. He serves Thorn Ashcombe, an alpha whose territory borders mine to the west." Ren folded her arms, trying to keep her voice steady despite the unfamiliar fear creeping into her chest. "Why would a rival alpha care about a village weaver?" she asked, though even as the words left her mouth she suspected she already understood the shape of the answer waiting for her. "Because word has reached him that my attention has been divided lately," Kalen said grimly. "Rumors travel faster than I would like, even across contested borders, and Thorn is the kind of alpha who searches constantly for weakness he can exploit. If he believes I have grown distracted by something, or someone, he will use that knowledge however he can, and I will not allow that to put you in danger because of my own carelessness." The weight of his words settled heavily over the small workshop, and Ren found herself sitting down slowly on the bench near her fire, processing the sudden and unwelcome shift from quiet evening visits and stolen ribbons to territorial politics and rival alphas who might see her as a target simply because a king's wolf had grown fond of her scent. "This is not what I agreed to," she said quietly, though there was more uncertainty in her voice than accusation. "I understood the ribbons. I understood the den. I did not understand that it might put me in danger from people I have never met and have no connection to whatsoever." Kalen crossed the small space between them and knelt in front of her, close enough that she could see the genuine worry etched into his expression. Worry that seemed to have little to do with political strategy and everything to do with her well-being specifically. "You have every right to be angry with me," he said. "I should have considered this possibility sooner, before allowing myself the comfort of these visits, without weighing the risk they might carry for you. I will increase patrols around the village immediately, and I will ensure you are never left without protection. But I understand if you would prefer I stay away entirely until this threat has passed." Ren studied his face for a long moment, searching for any trace of the cold, calculating king the village stories described, and finding instead only sincere concern, the same vulnerability she had glimpsed on the mountainside weeks before, when he first confessed the reason behind his wolf's strange fascination with her ribbons. Something in her chest ached at the thought of him simply disappearing from her life, to protect her from a danger that felt, in this moment, distant and abstract, compared to the very real warmth of his presence in front of her. "I did not say I wanted you to stay away," she said finally, her voice softer than before. "I said this is not what I agreed to." "Those are different things." Relief flickered across his features, quickly followed by renewed determination. "Then I will ensure it does not become more dangerous than it already is," he said. "I will not let Thorn or anyone else threaten you simply because my wolf found comfort where he was never supposed to look for it." Ren reached out, surprising herself as much as him, and rested her hand against his where it braced against the bench beside her. "For what it is worth," she said, "I do not regret any of it. Not the ribbons, not the den, not any of the strange turns this has taken since that first night with the pepper. I am frightened by what you have just told me, but I am not sorry for any of the rest." Something shifted in his expression at her words, softening further, and for a moment neither of them moved, the small workshop suddenly feeling far too quiet, far too charged with something neither of them had named aloud yet. He lifted his free hand slowly, brushing a strand of hair back from her face, with a gentleness that seemed almost at odds with the powerful frame she had seen shift into an enormous wolf weeks before, and Ren found herself leaning into the touch without fully deciding to. "I should go," he said finally, though he made no immediate move to do so. "My presence here in daylight already carries risk, and the longer I stay, the more likely it becomes that Thorn's scouts notice patterns they should not." "Then go," Ren said softly, though her hand remained where it rested against his. "But come back, however you can. I would rather face whatever danger this brings than lose what we have already built because we were too frightened to continue it." He rose slowly, reluctance clear in every line of his movement, and pressed a brief, warm kiss to her forehead before stepping back toward the door. "I will send guards to watch the village discreetly," he said. "You will not see them, but they will be there, and if anything at all feels wrong, anything unusual, I need you to send word to Draven Keep immediately." Ren nodded, and he lingered a moment longer at the threshold, amber eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her chest tighten in a way she was still not entirely accustomed to. Then he was gone, slipping out into the afternoon light and disappearing quickly around the corner of her workshop, leaving her alone, with a heart racing from more than simple fear. She spent the remainder of that day trying to focus on her work, though her thoughts kept drifting back to his words, to the shadow of danger now hanging over what had, until recently, felt like the simplest kind of quiet happiness. She did not yet know how far Thorn Ashcombe was willing to go to test the Draven Pack's strength, nor how deeply she herself would soon be drawn into the conflict brewing along the western border. But that evening, as she barred her door before bed, she found herself glancing toward the tree line more than once, watching for any sign of movement among the shadows, aware for the first time that the quiet peace of her small village might not remain untouched for very much longer. The attack came on a morning that had started like any other, gray and quiet, with mist still clinging to the low branches around the village when Ren set out to gather firewood along the eastern edge of the forest. She had told herself she would stay close to the village boundary, mindful of Kalen's warning from days before, but the fallen branches near her usual gathering spot had already been picked clean by other villagers, and she found herself drifting further into the trees than she intended, chasing the promise of dry, easily broken wood, a little deeper into the forest each time. She did not notice the two men until it was almost too late. They emerged from the mist without warning, moving with the deliberate quiet of people who had been trained to move unseen, and Ren felt her stomach drop the moment she caught sight of them, some instinct warning her, long before conscious thought caught up to the danger. She dropped the bundle of wood in her arms and turned to run, but one of the men was faster, closing the distance between them before she managed more than a few steps, his hand closing hard around her wrist and wrenching her backward with enough force to knock the breath from her lungs. she screamed, more from instinct than any real hope that someone might hear her this deep in the trees, and twisted hard against his grip, managing to land a solid strike against his forearm that loosened his hold, just enough for her to stumble free. The second man moved to block her path before she could get more than a few steps away, and Ren found herself trapped between them, heart pounding so hard she could hear nothing else, mind racing through every option and finding none of them good. "You will come quietly," the first man said, his voice flat and businesslike, as though this were simply another task on a long list, rather than an act that terrified her completely. "Lord Ashcombe wishes to speak with you, and it would go easier for everyone involved if you did not resist further." Ren's blood ran cold at the name, confirmation of exactly the danger Kaelin had warned her about now standing directly in front of her, with clear and immediate intent. She backed away instinctively, though there was nowhere useful to retreat to, trees pressing close on every side, and the two men advancing steadily to close whatever gap remained between them. She did not know how long she had before their patience ran out entirely, and they simply took her by force, but she did know, with sudden and desperate clarity, that she needed to buy whatever time she could. "I have done nothing to interest your lord," she said, forcing steadiness into her voice, despite the way her whole body trembled. "I am only a weaver. Whatever business he has, it has nothing to do with me." The second man laughed, low and humorless. "That is not what our lord believes," he said. "He believes the king's wolf has grown quite attached to you, and that attachment makes you valuable, whether you understand your own importance or not." Ren's mind raced, searching for any advantage, any distraction that might give her the opening she needed, and it was in that desperate moment that she remembered the small knife she carried in her satchel, more for cutting rope and thread than for any real defense, but sharp enough to matter if used correctly. She let her hand drift slowly toward the satchel still hanging at her hip, praying the movement looked like nothing more than nervous fidgeting, rather than the calculated reach it actually was. Before either man could close the remaining distance, a sound tore through the misty forest that stopped all three of them cold, a deep, furious howl that seemed to shake the very ground beneath their feet. Ren's heart leapt with a mixture of terror and desperate hope as she recognized the source instantly, even before the silver-black shape burst through the trees at full speed, moving with a ferocity she had never witnessed from him before. The wolf hit the first man hard enough to send him sprawling several feet away, and Ren used the distraction to scramble backward, putting distance between herself and the chaos erupting in front of her. The second man drew a blade, backing away warily from the enormous, snarling animal, now positioned protectively between Ren and both attackers, his amber eyes blazing with a fury that made even Ren's breath catch in her throat. "This is not your fight, wolf," the man said, though his voice carried far less confidence than his words suggested. "Our business is with the girl, not with you." The wolf's response was a low, rumbling growl that vibrated through the forest air, and he advanced a single step, forcing both men to retreat further despite their weapons and their earlier confidence. It was clear, even to Ren watching with her heart still hammering wildly, that neither man had anticipated facing the king's wolf directly, and that whatever plan Thorn Ashcombe had devised had not accounted for this level of immediate, personal danger. The first man, still recovering from the initial impact, scrambled back to his feet and exchanged a quick, uncertain glance with his companion. "We will return," he called out, already backing further away into the mist. "Our Lord's patience will not last forever, and next time, you will not be able to protect her from everything." They fled then, disappearing quickly into the fog-shrouded trees, and the wolf did not pursue, choosing instead to remain fixed in place between Ren and the direction they had gone, chest heaving with barely contained fury, every muscle in his massive body still coiled and ready. It was only once the sound of their retreat had faded entirely that he finally turned toward her, and the moment their eyes met, something in his posture crumbled, fierce protector giving way to visible, urgent concern. Ren's legs finally gave out from beneath her, adrenaline draining away all at once, and leaving her shaking uncontrollably as she sank to her knees in the damp forest undergrowth. The wolf was at her side instantly, pressing close, nudging gently at her shoulder, and her hands as though checking for injury, with an urgency that told her clearly how frightened he had been, how close this had come to becoming something far worse than a warning. "I am all right," she managed, though her voice shook badly enough to undercut the reassurance. "Frightened but all right. They did not hurt me." The wolf made a low sound, something between relief and continued distress, and pressed his large head against her chest, in a gesture so gentle, it seemed almost impossible coming from the same animal that had just driven off two armed attackers, with pure, terrifying force. Ren wrapped her arms around his neck without thinking, burying her face against his fur, as the last of her adrenaline finally broke apart into quiet, shuddering tears. They stayed like that for several long minutes, the forest slowly quieting around them as the immediate danger passed, until Ren finally found the strength to pull back, wiping at her eyes with the back of her hand. "We need to get back to the village," she said, "and you need to tell Kaylin what just happened, because this was not a warning anymore. This was an attempt to take me." The wolf's ears flattened, and something dark and dangerous flickered through his amber eyes, an expression Ren had not seen from him before, and hoped never to see directed at anything other than the men who had just threatened her. He rose to his feet and pressed close against her side, clearly intent on escorting her the entire way back rather than allowing any distance to open between them again, and together they made their way carefully out of the misty forest, every shadow now feeling far more threatening than it had only an hour before. By the time they reached the edge of the village, Ren's trembling had eased somewhat, replaced by a grim, steady resolve that surprised even her. She had been frightened, more frightened than she had ever been in her quiet life as a village weaver. But beneath that fear ran something else now, something harder, and more determined. Whatever Thorn Ashcombe believed he could accomplish by threatening her, he had badly underestimated both the wolf who had come tearing through the mist to protect her, and the resolve that had settled over her in the aftermath of nearly being taken from everything she knew. That evening, word reached Draven Keep of the attack through channels far faster than any messenger could travel on foot, carried instead through the bond between an alpha and his wolf, urgent and raw with fury, that Edmund Hale had rarely witnessed in all his years serving the Draven line. Kaylin arrived in Ashran within the hour, moving with a controlled intensity that made even his most seasoned guards keep careful distance, and when he finally reached Ren's workshop and found her safe, if shaken, something in his rigid posture finally eased, though the fury simmering beneath his calm exterior remained clearly, dangerously present. "This ends now," he said quietly, once he had assured himself thoroughly that she was truly unharmed. "Thorn has made his intentions clear, and I will not wait for him to try again before responding in kind." Ren, still processing the fear of the day, found herself gripping his hand tightly, uncertain whether she was seeking comfort or offering it, perhaps both at once. "Whatever you decide," she said, "I want to understand it. I am not simply a piece to be protected from a distance while decisions are made around me. I have earned the right to know what comes next." Kaylin looked at her for a long moment, something complicated passing behind his amber eyes, before he nodded slowly, accepting her words with a gravity that told her clearly he understood exactly how much courage it had taken for her to speak them. "Then you will know," he said. "Everything that follows, you will know, because you have already proven yourself far braver than most who have stood at the center of conflicts like this one." Outside, the last light of evening faded slowly over Ashran, and somewhere far to the west, Thorn Ashcombe received word of his scout's failure, with cold, calculating patience, already turning his thoughts toward whatever move he intended to make next, unaware that the woman he had underestimated possessed a resolve every bit as unyielding as the king whose attention she had captured so completely. By the following morning, Kaylin had made a decision that Ren initially resisted, though she eventually understood the necessity behind it, even as it unsettled the quiet, ordinary life she had built for herself in Ashran. He wanted her moved temporarily to Draven Keep, under the direct protection of his own guards, until the threat from Thorn Ashcombe could be properly addressed. Ren argued at first, unwilling to abandon her workshop and the trade she had built with her own hands, but the memory of the two men closing in on her in the misty forest remained sharp enough that her resistance faded faster than she expected. The journey to the keep took the better part of a day, escorted by 4 guards whose watchfulness never wavered, and Ren spent much of the ride studying the changing landscape with a mixture of nervousness and reluctant curiosity. She had never traveled this far from Ashran before, and the sight of Draven Keep rising against the horizon, its stone walls pale gray beneath the afternoon sun, filled her with an unease that had little to do with the danger she had already faced, and everything to do with the strangeness of stepping so completely into a world she had never expected to touch. The keep's interior proved just as intimidating as its exterior. Wide corridors lined with tapestries, depicting the Draven Pack's long history, servants and guards moving with practiced efficiency through halls that echoed with every footstep. Ren felt distinctly out of place among the polished stone and formal bearing of the court, painfully aware of her simple traveling clothes and the dye stains that never quite washed fully from her hands no matter how carefully she scrubbed them. Edmund Hale met her personally upon her arrival, his expression carefully neutral, though Ren could sense the assessment happening behind his calm gaze, the quiet cataloging of exactly what kind of person had captured his king's attention so completely. He escorted her to a set of rooms near the king's own quarters, explaining in measured tones that her safety was now the pack's highest priority, and though his words were courteous, Ren caught the faint edge of caution beneath them, the wariness of a man still uncertain what her presence truly meant, for the stability he had spent years helping to maintain. Word of her arrival spread quickly through the keep, and by evening, Ren had become acutely aware of the whispers following her through every corridor she passed. Some voices carried simple curiosity, wondering aloud who this village weaver might be, and why the king had brought her under such careful guard. Others carried something sharper, less kind, the kind of speculation that assumed the worst, simply because the situation defied easy explanation. She overheard one particularly cutting remark from a court Omega named Lyra, who suggested loudly enough to be overheard that the king's wolf had clearly lost whatever judgment it once possessed, chasing after some village girl with dye-stained hands, instead of an Omega of proper standing. Ren said nothing in response, though the words stung more than she expected, and she retreated to her assigned rooms earlier than necessary that evening, unwilling to give anyone the satisfaction of watching her react further. It was there that Kaelin found her, sitting alone near the window, watching the last light fade over unfamiliar grounds that felt nothing like the quiet comfort of her own small workshop. "You have heard the whispers already," he said, settling into the chair across from her, without waiting for invitation, a familiarity that had grown between them, despite the formal surroundings now enclosing their every interaction. Ren offered a tired half-smile. "It is difficult not to," she admitted. "I understand why they are saying it. I do not belong here, not in any way that makes sense to people who have spent their whole lives inside these walls." Kaelin's expression hardened slightly, though the anger in it was clearly directed elsewhere, rather than at her. "You belong wherever I choose to have you," he said firmly. "Court gossip has never determined the worth of anyone within these walls, and it will not begin determining yours, simply because you arrived under circumstances more dramatic than most." "That is easy for you to say," Ren replied, though there was no real bitterness in her tone, only weary honesty. "You were born into this. I was pulled into it by a wolf who could not stop stealing my ribbons." A reluctant smile broke across his face at that, easing some of the tension that had gathered in his shoulders since she arrived. "That wolf," he said, "has excellent taste, regardless of what court gossip believes about his judgment." Ren laughed despite herself, the sound surprising her as much as it seemed to please him, and for a moment, the weight of the day's whispers and the lingering fear from the forest attack eased enough that she felt something closer to herself again. He reached across the small distance between their chairs and took her hand, his thumb tracing slowly over her knuckles, in a gesture that felt far more intimate than the formal setting around them seemed to allow. "I know this is not what you wanted," he said quietly. "I know you did not choose any of this, not the danger, not the whispers, not the sudden weight of a world you never asked to be part of, but I am asking you to trust that I will not let it consume you, whatever else happens between now and whatever comes next." Ren studied his face for a long moment, searching for any hesitation behind his words and finding none. "I do trust you," she said finally. "That has never been the question. The question is whether I can find my own footing inside all of this, without losing the parts of myself that existed before any of it began." "You will not lose them," he said, with a certainty that steadied something anxious in her chest. "If anything, I suspect this place will need reminding of exactly what genuine strength looks like, and I cannot think of anyone better suited to provide that reminder than you." They sat together as the evening deepened further, discussing plans for the days ahead, the increased patrols along the border, the careful diplomatic messages Edmund had already begun drafting, to test whether Thorn Ashcombe might be persuaded toward restraint through official channels, before matters escalated further. Ren listened carefully, asking questions where she did not understand the political weight behind certain decisions. and found, somewhat to her own surprise, that Kaelin answered each one thoroughly, treating her curiosity not as an intrusion, but as a genuine contribution worth considering. It was well past midnight when he finally rose to leave, pausing at her door the same way he had paused at her workshop door weeks before, amber eyes holding hers with the same quiet intensity that had first drawn her attention on that misty mountainside. "Sleep if you can," he said softly. "Tomorrow will bring its own challenges, but tonight, at least, you are safe within these walls, whatever else the whispers might claim." After he left, Ren remained by the window for a long while, watching the stars scatter across the dark sky above Draven Keep, thinking of her small workshop far below in Ashwin, silent now and empty, and of the strange, winding path that had led her from blaming crows for stolen ribbons to sitting within the walls of a king's court, caught at the center of a conflict she had never sought but could no longer avoid facing directly. Whatever came next, she understood clearly now that there was no path back to the simple, quiet life she had known before. And though the realization frightened her in ways she was still learning to name, she found, beneath that fear, a steady thread of resolve that told her she was ready to meet whatever waited ahead. 5 days passed within the walls of Draven Keep, and Ren slowly began finding her footing amid the unfamiliar rhythms of court life, though the whispers never fully faded, and the weight of watchful eyes rarely left her entirely. She spent her mornings helping in the keep's weaving hall, teaching several of the younger staff techniques for richer, more lasting dyes, and found unexpected comfort in the familiar motion of thread and color, even in such an unfamiliar place. Her afternoons were often spent with Kaelin, reviewing the careful diplomatic efforts Edmund had initiated toward Thorn Ashcombe, though each message returned from the western border carried the same cold, evasive tone, offering no real assurance that the threat had diminished at all. On the 6th evening, word arrived that shattered whatever fragile calm had settled over the keep in the days prior. A rider from one of the border villages arrived just after sunset, exhausted and pale, bearing news that Thorn's forces had been spotted moving in greater numbers than any routine patrol required, positioned dangerously close to a stretch of the border near Ashwin itself. Worse still, the rider reported that several familiar faces had been seen among the scouting party, the same men who had accosted Ren in the misty forest days before. Kaelin's expression turned to stone as he listened to the report, and Ren, standing nearby in the war room where the council had gathered urgently, felt her stomach twist with dread at the implication settling over the room. "He knows she is no longer in the village," Edmund said grimly, studying the map spread across the table. "Which means this movement is not aimed at taking her again. It is likely a test, or worse, the beginning of something far more direct." The council debated long into the night, weighing options that ranged from immediate military response to further attempts at diplomacy, though the growing consensus leaned heavily toward the belief that Thorn had run out of patience for anything but open confrontation. Ren listened to every word, her earlier nervousness giving way to a steady, focused attention as she absorbed the full scope of what her presence, however unintentionally, had helped set into motion. It was near midnight when a runner burst into the war room, breathless and clearly alarmed, reporting that a small group had been spotted moving along the eastern approach to the keep itself, too disciplined and quiet to be simple travelers, moving with clear purpose toward the outer walls under cover of darkness. Kaelin was on his feet instantly, every trace of the careful, controlled king replaced by something sharper and more immediate, an alpha responding to direct threat against his own territory. Guards were dispatched within moments, and Ren found herself ushered quickly toward the inner chambers of the keep by 2 of Kaelin's most trusted guards, though she resisted the moment they reached the heavy doors meant to seal her safely away from whatever was unfolding outside. "I am not simply going to hide while everyone else faces this," she said firmly, though her heart pounded with fear at the sounds of distant shouting now carrying faintly through the stone corridors. "Your safety is the priority," one of the guards insisted, though Ren could see the uncertainty in his expression, the awareness that arguing with her carried its own risks, given how deeply the king's attention was now bound to her well-being. Before the disagreement could continue further, a sound rose through the corridor that made every hair on Ren's body stand on end, a deep, furious howl that echoed through the stone halls with unmistakable rage. Kaelin's wolf. She recognized it instantly, and something in that sound told her clearly that whatever fighting had broken out beyond the keep's walls had grown serious enough to demand his fullest, most immediate response. She did not remain in the inner chamber long. Driven by a fear she could not fully name, and a fierce protective instinct she had not expected to feel so strongly for a place she had only known a matter of days, Ren slipped past the momentarily distracted guards and made her way toward the sound of the fighting, following corridors she barely knew toward the outer courtyard, where torchlight flickered wildly against the stone walls. What she found there stole the breath from her lungs entirely. The courtyard had become a chaos of shouting guards and clashing steel, several intruders having breached the outer perimeter before being met by Draven's defenders, and at the center of it all stood the silver-black wolf, moving with a speed and ferocity that seemed almost impossible for a creature of his size, driving back attacker after attacker with controlled, devastating precision. Ren pressed herself against the shadow of a nearby archway, watching the scene unfold with her heart lodged firmly in her throat, and it was there, half hidden in the dark, that she spotted movement far too close to her own position. A lone figure separated from the main fighting, moving with deliberate stealth along the courtyard's edge, clearly attempting to circle around the chaos entirely. She recognized him immediately, even in the uncertain torchlight, the same cold, businesslike bearing of the man who had grabbed her wrist in the misty forest days before. He had come for her, using the chaos as cover, to slip through unnoticed, while the keep's defenders remained occupied with the more visible threat. Her instincts screamed at her to run, but running would mean crossing open ground, exposing herself to exactly the danger she was trying to avoid. Instead, she pressed herself further into the shadows, scanning desperately for any route back toward the inner chambers that would not require passing directly in his path. The man's eyes swept the courtyard methodically, and Ren watched in growing horror as his gaze began drifting toward the archway where she hid. She did not wait for him to spot her fully. The moment his attention shifted elsewhere, tracking a burst of movement near the main gate, Ren broke from her hiding place and sprinted toward the nearest corridor entrance, footsteps echoing far louder than she wanted against the stone beneath her. Behind her, she heard a sharp exclamation, quickly followed by the unmistakable sound of pursuit, and her heart hammered so violently she thought it might burst entirely from the sheer terror of the chase. She rounded a corner too quickly, nearly losing her footing on the smooth stone floor, and caught a fleeting glimpse of torchlight ahead, promising other people, other guards, safety if only she could reach it in time. Her pursuer's footsteps grew louder behind her, closing the distance far faster than she had hoped, and just as his hand reached out to seize her shoulder, a massive shape crashed through the corridor entrance behind them both, moving with a speed that defied belief. The wolf hit the man with the full force of his charge, driving him hard into the stone wall, with an impact that echoed through the corridor, and Ren stumbled to a halt several paces ahead, turning back just in time to see Kalen's wolf standing over the now thoroughly subdued attacker, teeth bared, chest heaving with barely restrained fury. Guards arrived moments later, drawn by the commotion, quickly securing the man while the wolf remained fixed in place, unwilling to step back until Ren herself moved close enough for him to confirm, beyond any doubt, that she remained unharmed. She sank to her knees before him, wrapping her arms around his neck without a single thought toward the courtiers or guards now gathering around them, and felt the tremor running through his powerful frame slowly begin to ease. "You came for me," she whispered against his fur, though the words felt inadequate for the terror and gratitude tangled together in her chest. "Even in the middle of everything happening outside, you still came." The wolf pressed his head gently against her shoulder, and though he could not answer in words, the answer was unmistakable regardless, present in every line of his tense, protective posture, and the fierce, unwavering way he had cut through chaos and danger to reach her the moment he sensed the threat closing in. By the time the courtyard fighting fully subsided, and the last of Thorn's remaining forces were driven back from the keep's walls, dawn had begun creeping over the horizon, painting the sky in soft shades of gray and gold that felt strangely peaceful after the violence of the night before. Kalen, shifted back to his human form, and bearing several shallow marks from the fighting that he waved off as inconsequential, found Ren still sitting near the corridor, where the wolf had stopped her attacker, wrapped in a blanket one of the guards had provided, watching the activity in the courtyard with wide, exhausted eyes. He crossed the distance between them quickly, and pulled her into an embrace that spoke more clearly than any words could have managed, and Ren held onto him just as tightly, the events of the night finally catching up to her all at once, in a wave of relief and lingering fear. "This has gone too far," he murmured against her hair. "Thorn has crossed a line tonight that leaves no room left for further diplomacy. Whatever restraint I have shown until now ends with what happened in these halls tonight." Ren pulled back slightly, studying his exhausted, determined expression, and felt a matching resolve settling over her own fear. "Then finish it," she said quietly. "Whatever it takes. I am done being frightened of shadows in the dark, and I suspect you are done allowing them to threaten what matters to you as well." Kalen's expression hardened with grim determination, and he nodded once, decisively. "Then it ends soon," he said. "One way or another, this ends soon." In the days following the attack on the keep, Kalen moved with the focused intensity of a leader preparing for open conflict, gathering his war council each morning to review reports from the border and finalize plans that would, if diplomacy failed entirely, bring the full strength of the Draven Pack against Thorn Ashcombe's territory. Ren watched this transformation with a strange mixture of pride and quiet fear, understanding fully now the weight of responsibility that rested on his shoulders, a weight she had unknowingly added to the moment her scent first caught his wolf's attention weeks before. She insisted on remaining informed of every development, and though a few of the council members bristled initially at her presence during these discussions, Edmund Hale had come to accept her involvement with something approaching genuine respect, particularly after witnessing her calm, clear thinking during the aftermath of the courtyard attack. Whatever doubts had lingered about her place within these walls seemed to be fading, replaced gradually by a grudging acknowledgement that she brought something valuable to the table beyond simple sentiment. It was on the 9th day since her arrival at the keep that news reached them, which shattered whatever fragile momentum toward careful, measured response had been building. A scout returning from routine patrol near Ashran brought word that would haunt Ren long after the immediate shock of hearing it had faded. The ridge above the village, the quiet hollow where she had first discovered the den lined with her stolen ribbons, had been burned. The scout described finding the clearing scorched and blackened, the careful weave of ribbon and moss reduced entirely to ash, the surrounding trees scarred by fire that had clearly been set deliberately, rather than sparked by any natural cause. A message had been left nearby, carved crudely into a nearby stone, warning that anything the Draven Pack claimed as precious could be destroyed just as easily, wherever it might be found. Ren felt the news land like a physical blow, grief rising unexpectedly sharp for a place that had, despite its strange origins, come to represent something profoundly important in the short time since she discovered it. It had been the first proof she witnessed of Kalen's wolf finding peace after years of restless wandering, the physical evidence of a bond neither of them had fully understood or named at the time. And now, it existed only as ash and blackened stone at the top of a mountain she had once climbed, with nothing more than curiosity and mild irritation over missing ribbons. Kalen's reaction, when the news reached him, was unlike anything Ren had witnessed from him before. He did not shout or rage visibly, but something in his entire bearing changed, a stillness settling over him that felt far more dangerous than any outward display of anger might have suggested. He left the war room abruptly, and Ren followed after a moment's hesitation, finding him standing alone in a small courtyard garden, his hands braced against a low stone wall, shoulders tight with barely contained emotion. "I am so sorry," she said softly, approaching carefully, uncertain what comfort she could possibly offer, for a loss that ran so much deeper than simple property destroyed. He did not turn immediately, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a rawness she had not heard from him before, not even during the chaos of the courtyard attack days earlier. "That den was the first place my wolf found peace in years," he said quietly. "Longer than years, if I am honest, since before the bond that broke him initially. And Thorn destroyed it simply to send a message, simply to prove he could reach into something precious and reduce it to nothing, without hesitation." Ren moved closer, resting a hand gently against his back, feeling the tension coiled tight beneath her palm. "Then we build another one," she said, her voice steady despite the ache still lodged in her own chest at the thought of the burned ridge. "He does not get to take that from you, from either of you, simply by destroying wood and stone and ribbon. What mattered about that place was never the materials, it was what you built together there, and that cannot be burned away so easily." Kalen finally turned to face her, and the raw grief in his expression slowly gave way to something steadier, something anchored by her words, in a way that seemed to settle the worst of the storm raging behind his amber eyes. "You are right," he said finally. "Though I will admit, it does little to ease the fury I feel toward the man who ordered it done." That evening, word of the burned den spread quickly through the keep, and something shifted noticeably in the mood among the pack members who had previously regarded the situation with cautious detachment. What had once seemed a distant political conflict, relevant mainly to the king and his closest advisors, now felt personal to everyone within Draven's walls. The wolf's grief, raw and public during the moment he learned of the destruction, had revealed clearly to the entire court exactly how deeply his connection to Ren truly ran. And rather than fueling further gossip and whispered doubt, the revelation seemed instead to shift sentiment firmly in her favor. Lyra, the same Court Omega who had spoken so cuttingly during Ren's first days at the keep, found her that evening in the quiet weaving hall, her expression carrying none of its earlier sharpness. "I did not understand," Lyra admitted, somewhat stiffly, clearly unaccustomed to offering anything resembling an apology. "I assumed the king's attention toward you was simple infatuation, easily forgotten once the novelty faded. I did not realize how deeply this ran, for either of you." Ren accepted the near apology with quiet grace, understanding well enough that pride made such admissions difficult regardless of sincerity behind them. "It is easy to misjudge things from a distance," she said simply. "I do not hold it against you." As night settled fully over Draven Keep, Kalen gathered his full war council once more, and this time there was no lingering debate about the wisdom of measured restraint. Thorn Ashcombe had moved from threats and attempted abductions to open, deliberate destruction meant purely to wound, and the entire pack, from Edmund Hale down to the newest guard recruits, understood clearly that whatever careful diplomacy had once seemed possible, no longer held any real chance of preventing what was to come. "We march at first light," Kalen announced, his voice carrying a controlled authority that left no room for further debate. Thorn wished to send a message. I intend to answer it in a manner he cannot possibly misunderstand. Ren, standing near the back of the war room, felt a complicated tangle of fear and fierce, protective resolve settle over her as the council began finalizing plans for what would surely become the most dangerous confrontation the Draven pack had faced in years. Whatever came next, she understood with sudden clarity that there was no path forward that did not require facing Thorn Ashcombe directly, and though the thought terrified her, she found herself standing taller, steadier, ready to face whatever role she might yet play in bringing this conflict to its resolution. The Draven forces departed at dawn, a long column of guards and warriors moving with grim determination toward the western border, and Ren, despite gentle but firm suggestions that she remain safely within the keep, insisted on traveling with the healers' company that followed several ranks behind the main force. She had no skill with weapons and no illusions about her ability to affect the outcome of any direct confrontation, but she refused to sit idle within stone walls while Kalen rode toward danger that existed, at its core, because of the bond that had grown between them. The journey to the border took 2 full days, the mood among the traveling force growing steadily more tense as the distance to Thorn Ashcombe's territory shortened. Ren spent much of the ride near the healers, learning what she could of basic field treatment, grateful for something useful to occupy her hands and mind, rather than dwelling entirely on the fear gnawing steadily at her thoughts. Kalen rode near the front of the column throughout, though he found moments each evening to seek her out at the camp, their conversations quieter and more urgent than the easy exchanges that had once passed between them in her small workshop. It was on the second evening, as the camp settled for what everyone understood might be the last quiet rest before actual confrontation, that Edmund Hale approached Ren privately, his expression carrying a gravity that immediately put her on edge. "I have received troubling word," he said quietly, glancing around to ensure no one else stood close enough to overhear. "One of our own scouts, a man named Corin who has served the pack for several years, was seen meeting privately with one of Thorn's known associates, 3 days before the attack on the keep." Ren's stomach tightened at the implication. "You believe someone within the pack has been passing information to Thorn," she said, and Edmund's grim nod confirmed the suspicion immediately. "I cannot yet prove it fully," he admitted, "but the timing troubles me greatly. Thorn has known too much, too quickly, throughout this entire conflict, Information he should not have had access to, without some source feeding it to him from within our own ranks. I have not yet informed the king, as I wish to gather more certain proof before raising an accusation this serious, but I felt you should know, given how directly this threat has touched you already. Ren absorbed the information with growing unease, understanding the danger such a betrayal represented, not just for the immediate conflict ahead, but for the deeper trust that held the Draven pack together. Watch him carefully, she said finally, and tell Kaelin the moment you have proof enough to act on it. Whatever this conflict becomes, it cannot afford hidden enemies working against it from within. Edmund agreed, and though he cautioned her again to keep the matter quiet until more certain evidence emerged, Ren found herself watching the camp with new wariness that night, studying faces among the gathered guards and wondering which among them might be feeding information to the enemy waiting beyond the border ahead. The following morning, the Draven column reached the agreed meeting point along the contested border, a wide, open field flanked by low hills that had, in generations past, served as neutral ground for exactly this kind of confrontation between rival packs. Thorn Ashcomb's forces already waited on the opposite side, their numbers roughly matching Draven's own, banners bearing his territory's dark green and gray colors snapping sharply in the morning wind. Kaelin rode forward alone to the center of the field, as tradition demanded, and Thorn advanced to meet him, a tall, broad man with cold gray eyes and a bearing that radiated calculated confidence rather than open hostility. Ren watched from a careful distance, heart pounding, as the two alphas exchanged words too quiet for her to hear clearly, though the tension radiating between them was unmistakable even from afar. She learned later, from Edmund who had ridden close enough to catch fragments of the exchange, that Thorn had offered terms, an arrangement that would allow him to claim a portion of Draven's western territory, in exchange for ending hostilities immediately. Terms clearly designed less as genuine negotiation, and more as a test of exactly how far Kaelin's restraint might bend under pressure. Kaelin's response, delivered with the same controlled authority Ren had come to recognize during council meetings at the keep, rejected the terms entirely, instead offering Thorn a different choice altogether, one that would settle the matter through direct challenge, rather than through the wider bloodshed a full confrontation between both forces would inevitably bring. A challenge between alphas, witnessed by both packs, with the outcome binding regardless of which side claimed victory. Ren's breath caught when word of the proposed challenge reached her, understanding immediately the danger it represented, the possibility that everything might come down to a single, direct confrontation between Kaelin and a rival who had already proven himself willing to threaten, to burn, to attempt abduction without hesitation. She wanted desperately to intervene, to argue against a plan that placed everything on Kaelin facing Thorn alone, but she understood, watching the resolve etched into his distant posture, that this decision had already been made, weighed carefully against the alternative of a wider battle that would cost far more lives on both sides. Thorn, after a long moment of consideration, accepted the challenge, apparently confident enough in his own strength to believe the outcome would favor him, regardless of the terms. The two forces began arranging themselves along the edges of the field, forming a wide circle that would serve as the arena for whatever confrontation was about to unfold, and Ren found herself pushed gently but firmly toward the front of the Draven ranks by Edmund, who seemed to understand, without her needing to explain, exactly how important it was that she witness whatever came next. As preparations continued, a commotion arose near the edge of the Draven formation, drawing Ren's attention away from the central field for a brief moment. She turned to see two guards restraining a third man, his expression twisted with panic as he struggled uselessly against their grip, and her stomach dropped as she recognized the scout Edmund had mentioned 2 nights before, the one suspected of passing information to Thorn's forces. Edmund arrived quickly, his expression hard and unforgiving as he confronted the struggling man directly. "We found him attempting to signal across the field," he said grimly, loud enough for those nearby to hear clearly. "Proof enough, I think, of exactly where his loyalty has truly rested throughout this entire conflict." The scout's protests died quickly under the weight of evidence Edmund produced. Coded messages found on his person that matched patterns intercepted from Thorn's own correspondence over recent weeks. Ren watched the confrontation with a mixture of relief and lingering unease, grateful that the betrayal had been caught before it could cause further harm, but troubled by how close it had come to succeeding entirely undetected. "There is no time to deal with this properly before the challenge begins," Edmund said finally, turning to address the guards holding the traitor firmly in place. "Secure him for now. Justice will be addressed once this confrontation reaches its conclusion, one way or another." As the guards led the struggling man away, Ren's attention returned to the center of the field, where Kalen had dismounted and begun removing the outer layers of his formal attire, preparing for the shift that would carry him into his wolf form for whatever confrontation waited ahead. Across the field, Thorn did the same, and the assembled forces on both sides fell into a tense, watchful silence as both alphas prepared themselves for a challenge that would determine far more than simple territorial dispute. Ren found herself moving instinctively toward the front edge of the Draven line, close enough now to see clearly as Kalen paused before shifting, his amber eyes finding hers across the distance separating them. Whatever words might have passed between them in a quieter moment felt unnecessary now, communicated instead through the steady, determined look he held for just a moment before turning fully toward the field and the confrontation waiting at its center. The air around him shimmered, his human form giving way to the massive silver-black wolf Ren had first encountered, stealing ribbons from her garden weeks before. And across the field, Thorn's own shift completed a heartbeat later, revealing a wolf nearly matched in size, dark gray fur bristling with barely restrained aggression. The two animals faced each other across the wide expanse of trampled grass, and the assembled forces on both sides fell utterly silent, waiting for whatever came next, to finally settle the conflict that had, in the span of only a few short weeks, transformed a quiet village weaver's life, entirely beyond recognition. The two wolves circled each other slowly across the trampled grass, neither willing to commit to the first move, each measuring the other with the careful patience of experienced fighters, who understood exactly how costly a single mistake might prove. Ren stood frozen at the edge of the Draven line, her hands clenched so tightly around the fabric of her sleeves that her knuckles had gone pale, every muscle in her body tensed with a fear she could not fully control despite her earlier resolve to remain steady. Thorn struck first, a sudden, powerful lunge aimed at Kalen's flank, and the Draven wolf twisted aside with a speed that belied his considerable size, avoiding the worst of the strike, though Thorn's claws still caught along his shoulder, drawing a line of dark blood against silver fur. Ren gasped, the sound lost among the murmur rising from both gathered forces, and forced herself to keep watching despite every instinct urging her to look away from the danger unfolding before her. The wolves clashed again, a blur of gray and silver, teeth and claws, each exchange leaving fresh marks on both combatants as the fight settled into a punishing rhythm of strike and counter, retreat and advance. Kalen fought with a controlled precision that reminded Ren of the calm, calculated king she had come to know during council meetings, each movement deliberate despite the raw ferocity driving it, while Thorn's approach carried a wilder, more reckless energy, powerful but less measured, relying on brute strength where Kalen relied on discipline, honed through years of careful restraint. The confrontation stretched on longer than Ren expected, both wolves showing signs of exhaustion as the battle continued, blood matting fur on both sides, breath coming in ragged, visible gasps in the cool morning air. She found herself gripping the arm of the healer standing beside her, unable to fully process the fear twisting through her chest with each fresh exchange of claws and teeth, each moment where either combatant might land the decisive blow that would settle everything. It was Thorn who made the critical mistake first, overextending on a lunge meant to end the fight quickly, driven perhaps by growing frustration at his failure to secure a decisive advantage despite his considerable strength. Kalen seized the opening instantly, twisting beneath the strike and driving forward with the full force of his weight, pinning Thorn firmly against the ground, in a position that left the gray wolf's throat fully exposed, utterly vulnerable to the killing strike that tradition and the terms of the challenge now permitted. The field fell into absolute silence, every witness on both sides holding their breath as the outcome hung suspended in that single, prolonged moment. Ren watched, her heart pounding so violently she felt certain everyone around her must hear it, as Kalen held his position, powerful jaws poised above Thorn's throat, amber eyes blazing with the fury of every threat, every act of violence Thorn had ordered against people and places that mattered deeply to him. But the killing strike never came. Instead, Kalen held perfectly still for a long, tense moment, before slowly stepping back, releasing Thorn from the pin, without delivering the final blow the tradition of the challenge would have allowed. He shifted back to human form immediately after, standing tall and bloodied but resolute above his defeated rival. And his voice, when it finally broke the heavy silence, carried clearly across the entire field. "You are defeated," he said, addressing Thorn directly, as the gray wolf slowly shifted back as well, revealing a man breathing hard, blood staining his side where Kalen's final strikes had landed. "By the terms of this challenge, witnessed by both our peoples, you will withdraw your forces entirely from any claim against Draven territory, and you will make full restitution for every act of violence committed against my people during this conflict, including the destruction at Ashrin and the attempts made against a person under my direct protection." Thorn, still catching his breath on the ground, looked up with an expression that mixed grudging respect with clear humiliation, though he offered no argument against the terms, understanding well enough that the challenge had been fair and its outcome decisive beyond dispute. "I accept the terms," he said finally, his voice rough but steady. "You fought with more restraint than I expected, Draven. I will not forget it." Kalen extended a hand toward his defeated rival, helping him rise despite the tension still thick in the air around them, a gesture that seemed to settle something uncertain among the assembled witnesses on both sides, a signal that whatever bitterness had driven this conflict might yet find its way toward something resembling peace, however uneasy, in the days ahead. Ren did not wait for further formality before breaking from the Draven line entirely, crossing the trampled field at a run despite the healers calling after her to wait, and Kalen turned just in time to catch her as she reached him, pulling her close despite the blood and exhaustion still marking his frame. She buried her face against his shoulder, relief and lingering fear finally breaking loose all at once, and felt his arms tighten around her with a warmth that made the entire brutal confrontation feel, for just a moment, distant and unreal. "It is over," he murmured against her hair, his voice rough with exhaustion, but steady with genuine relief. "Whatever comes next, this particular danger is finished." Around them, both packs began the slow process of standing down, tension easing gradually, as word spread of the challenge's decisive outcome and the terms that would follow. Edmund approached quietly, offering both congratulations and a reminder that the captured traitor still awaited judgment, though even that unfinished matter felt manageable now, compared to the weight of open conflict that had hung over them only hours before. The journey back to Ashrin took place several days later, once matters at the border had been properly settled, and Thorn's withdrawal confirmed beyond doubt. Ren returned first to her workshop, finding it exactly as she had left it, dust gathering lightly on her work table, dried dye pots waiting patiently for her return. But it was the ridge above the village that drew her attention most strongly, and she climbed the familiar path once more, this time with Kalen walking beside her, rather than trailing behind in wolf form, both of them silent as they approached the clearing where the den had once stood. The destruction was as complete as the scout had reported, blackened stone and scorched earth marking what had once been a careful, colorful nest built from stolen ribbons and quiet devotion. Ren felt her throat tighten at the sight, grief rising fresh despite everything that had happened since the news first reached her at the keep. "We will build it again," Kalen said softly, echoing the promise she had made to him weeks before in the quiet courtyard garden. "Better than before, if such a thing is possible." Over the following weeks, villagers from Ashrin and members of the Draven pack worked together to clear the burned clearing and rebuild the den, this time with proper stone reinforcement beneath the natural hollow, though Ren insisted on weaving fresh ribbons throughout the structure regardless, unwilling to let Thorn's cruelty erase the meaning the original den had carried. Mira, finally let in on the full, strange truth of everything that had unfolded, helped gather fresh moss and pine needles, laughing freely at the story of the pepper trap and the wolf's memorable sneeze, once the fear surrounding the conflict had fully faded. On the evening the rebuilt den was finally completed, Ren climbed the ridge one final time, carrying a single ribbon she had saved specifically for this purpose, dyed in a deep, rich blue that had taken her the better part of a week to perfect. Kalen waited for her there, already shifted into his wolf form, watching with quiet anticipation as she approached the entrance of the den that had, against every reasonable expectation, become the foundation of everything meaningful that followed their unlikely beginning. "This one is not stolen," she said softly, kneeling beside him and tying the ribbon carefully around his foreleg, rather than simply adding it to the woven walls surrounding them. This one, I am giving you freely, because whatever strange path brought us here, from stolen ribbons to a burned den to a battlefield and back again, I would not trade any part of it, however frightening some of it proved to be along the way. The wolf pressed his head gently against her shoulder, and Wren felt the warmth of that simple gesture settle deep into her chest, steady and certain in a way nothing in her life had ever quite matched before. Below them, the village of Ashwren settled into evening quiet, crows calling softly from the eaves of workshop roofs across the valley, entirely innocent, as they always had been, of the mischief so long and unfairly blamed upon them. And on the ridge above, in a den lined with ribbon freely given rather than secretly taken, an Alpha King's wolf finally found the lasting peace he had spent so many restless years searching for, resting beside the one person whose quiet, steady presence had proven strong enough to hold it.